sure you can give me some name, some group. You have the woman, usual. You have the children, usual. All of the pictures are taken in Bangladesh, sorry. The elderly, again. The people with disability. The extreme poor, we're very good as well on that one. The indigenous minority as well, and etc. Why is that so important to be able to come back to that? Is that it has been almost like, what, 2-3 decades now that we are talking already about marginalized group, neglected group, people that are more extremely vulnerable or more vulnerable than some other. But if we're just talking like extreme poor, indigenous minority, women, children, which one of them are more vulnerable than the other? And in the case of a disaster, if we are like about having a cyclone, is it not all of the community, all of the villagers who are going to be vulnerable, who can be neglected group? So what are really the benchmark? How can you identify a group and how you can compare a group to another? So it's very important to question actually what we meant by neglected group and how we want to conceive that, and especially when we think at the field level and when we think about program. So you usually ask, okay, who are they? Children, women. Yes, of course, it's very important to know where they are, what they're doing, what are the kind of characteristics we have for each of them. But what are the indicators that we have? What are the benchmarks? Is it different when we think about food security? Is it different when we think about adaptation? Is it different if we think about disaster risk reduction? Are we having like the same kind of criteria and indicator when we think about vulnerability? Who define, who state who are the neglected group? Is it the state? Is it the NGO? Is it the donor? Can be like the definition of what are a neglected group be the same in each of the country at the local level? Do we really have neglected groups that are more marginalized than another? I asked that already. How can you compare which one are less vulnerable or more vulnerable as well? And especially the question about when. Is it women and children are neglected group that are going to be from the time 1 to the time 5, for example, the same neglected group all over a time frame of a project? Are we not going to go outside it and going to put some other stakeholders outside the participation to program? So by saying and using neglected group, are we not going to marginalize already a category of people in the area where we are working when we think about adaptation? Can a group, being neglected or not, can be just neglected just for a period, a phase, and then for how long? Is it just for the time of the program or the assessment of the program? Can it be even after a program? So what is very important here is that when we think about neglected group, we do have to ask a set of questions, not only like for us to be able to identify them, but to really understand that it belongs to a cycle. And our activity, when we're going like to think about that, when we're going to question about that, we're going to improve our capacity to address that problem. But maybe at the time of a program, for example, we won't be able to analyze or to target all of the people who are in need or who could be in need in the future. Just a case study is coming from Bangladesh. What came like in 2005 was like a cyclone in Bangladesh, and most of the NGO and, I mean, I'm not against the NGO, no offense, but most of the aid worker and NGO and donor were like, okay, we have to help. Yeah, great. It's our duty to help. Yeah, okay. But then I was like, okay, where are the extreme poor? Where are the women? Where are the people with disability? Great. So all of the funds, all of the target was for the extreme poor, for the neglected group that we kind of know already, women, children, person with disability. But the one who really lost a lot in the coastal area during ELA, that was the middle class. The middle class who were capable to have like some people who just like lost all of their chicken and all, but they were not considered as extreme poor because they were already like having some item. So the people, the middle class, were kind of putting aside because they were not anymore priority. And I think that is where we have to be very careful when we think about neglected group. Knowing how to define it, knowing how to identify it, yes, but knowing how to move with a concept that is actually moving, that is actually changing. That is our challenge here. And when we think about a group that can fall into vulnerability after, I mean, I remember making some joke with my student as well about, no offense if there is any American, but we were always saying, like, well, the extreme poor, they are in Bangladesh, the extreme poor, they will be in Pakistan, you know, like the kind of stereotype that we have, as the same as we have about the group who will be always affected by climate change. And then, like, New York. Or last week, France. 60% of all of the different airplanes had to cancel during 2 to 3 days because they were not capable to adapt, they were not capable to cope. And you find out 64,000 people in one district in Paris not being able to have electricity. So what are we questioning here is there is a necessity for us to think outside the box. And I'm just taking another example, that's the climate-induced migrants. I guess I just have 4 more minutes. That is a kind of non-official, let's say, neglected group for now. Why do I say non-official? Because we're starting to have like headline about it, we're starting to think about it, climate change refugee, climate-induced migrant, environmental-induced migration. I mean, all of those terms, but who are they? Where are they going? From where they're coming? All of those questioning, if we think about each of the category that I have been like bringing at the beginning of the presentation, each of those groups have a veil of ignorance. There is really a lack of understanding because of the complexity of each of the contexts. And when we think about climate-induced migration, what is the most important, what is the main threat when we think about it as a neglected group, is that easily it can fall into like a security pattern, in a security discourse. Why am I saying that? Because it's very easy to say like, hey, flood in Pakistan, flood in Bangladesh, meaning it will equal to maybe 100,000 people or family that will be moving. And then you're thinking about where? What for how long? So you usually have the discourse that can be really related with the security-based discourse. And that is where we have a danger, and that is why knowing what is a neglected group, knowing how you can prepare a neglected group that is and that could be in the future, that's really our challenge here. So I guess at the beginning of the session, the main question was like, so how mainstream development actors should do things differently in the future? It was written on the paper, so. Well, they were not so bad, okay? And I think like many of the people like around us like today have been working a lot and trying like to push actually for mainstreaming women, for mainstreaming climate change adaptation into like all of the development agency that we have now all around the world. And there is nothing as such new that we have to rethink, but maybe what we have to rethink in another way is the past, and especially how to capture all of the past knowledge, all of the lessons learned that we have, and especially the failure as well. Talking about adaptation is one thing. It's great. We can all exchange our beautiful case studies. We can all exchange about, okay, we should do like gender like that, because it has been done like that. But maybe what is more important, when you are in those countries is to know what you should not do, or what could be a failure. And it's where like maladaptation can actually help to shape a new type of knowledge that is not only made of good example, but mainly about constructive failure. Being aware of the complexity of a changing Asia and Pacific, it's very funny. Like, for my side, like I started like a couple of years ago, and every year is changing. All of the data are changing. And even if I'm building like a method that will try to really like have in terms of statistic, will be perfect in terms of method, as the moving Asia is like so quick, I have to re-update everything. And I think like we have to be able to build not only like new issue and new angle, but especially the method around that. What are the research that are needed? What type of reflection we can have in such a short notice, short time? Because we have like such an energy in Asia Pacific where society is like moving drastically that we have to be able to capture it maybe with new tool. Well, that's common acknowledgement. And yeah, I mean, I will never emphasize enough. I mean, we have to think outside the box, designing new frame of analysis. So when we're thinking about neglected group, I mean, we should not limit ourselves into the classical category. We must think as well, like in the future, in the scenario, who are going like to be really the extreme vulnerable. And it's maybe not the one that we see today. But we need to be able like, to let a room for maneuver. I'm sorry, that's very French, but I hope you understand that. The room of maneuver is to really be able to let the flexibility in the future for different stakeholders to be able to shape on their own different type of definition and as well different type of program that I hope will be able to address differently or more effectively adaptation. Well, I guess I'm on time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ratana. We have a few minutes for questions and answers. But before that, just to facilitate the discussion, allow me, if you will, to probably just emphasize a few threads from the presentations made by our panelists. And I start with Ratana. I think she has reminded us to go back to basics, which is what, when we talk about vulnerable or neglected groups, what exactly do they mean? And what do we mean by neglected relative to what? Her message is for not only clarity in terms of definitions, but also flexibility in recognizing that the context changes, and therefore the premises and the parameters for vulnerability or exclusion, she did not use that word, but I introduced that, also has to change. And therefore, we have to be thinking out of the box, as she says, and also looking at a more temporal dimension of how these definitions evolve. Thank you, Ratna, for reminding us of these basic questions. Related to this also is Bernadette's point about unpacking neglected groups. And from her argument, she's saying that they tend to be lumped up in a category, in a black box almost, where everything and anybody who's not out there in the center is included. And usually that would be the categories that Ratana has then listed for us. And the plea in her case is to understand that it's not necessarily this individuals as well, but perhaps the relationships that define the interactions of these individuals relative to the larger, more dominant sphere. And in her presentation, she emphasized addressing issues of women, but not necessarily gender. Gender being this whole relational interactions across men and women. And she asked for a deliberate transformation or transformative solutions and strategies. And part of that, I am reading perhaps more than what she might have explicitly stated, is the need to redefine frameworks, which is also what Ratana was mentioning towards the last part of her presentation. Redefining frameworks and conceptual definitions so that the center, the periphery, the boundaries, and the margins are really well articulated. And a subtext to that, I think, that does not really come very clearly in this panel is the issue of power that underlines all of this relationship. The centers can shift. For example, geopolitical centers shifting to this part of the world. And definitions also shift, which then redefines the nature of these interactions. Reagan focused on a particular sector, the forest sector, where discussions of climate change adaptation and mitigation has cast forests and forest sector in a new light. If you talk about sectors within agriculture, forestry, finance, industry, etc., those in the forestry sector would argue that the forest sector is a marginalized, neglected sector in terms of its budget allocation within governments, the focus in terms of development priorities, use for land, etc., etc. However, they have come to the center because of a program or an attention to forest in its potential to sequester carbon through programs like reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And the reason for that is that there is also a cost implication. They happen to be the low-lying fruit. And key to that is the participation of local people who are mapped to these landscapes where the forests are. Either they get protected, they get preserved, they get conserved, or embellished through enrichment planting, for example, and enterprise, or they get burned, they go puff in smoke, and therefore there goes your carbon sequestration. In which case participation becomes not only practical, necessary, but also instrumental. And here is where safeguards, the point of Reagan's presentation, has been introduced as a mechanism to ensure, facilitate that there is not only participation, but consultation and a meaningful engagement of those we actually need at the operational level. But there are also questions of equity, who is not at the table that has to be there. And the issue of social justice and equity has come up not because of mainstream actors necessarily, but because those who have been marginalized for a long time are being asked to carry the burden of a whole lot of different responsibilities for development without necessarily the commensurate rewards. So related to this is the issue of benefit sharing that I think Reagan has as one of her bullet points. And also the demand that they be at least represented on the table. In many cases, networks and networking and brokers is a concept that was introduced by Gareth in his presentation. The need for trusted brokers, and that's the reality of how these interactions form. Trust relationships and networks as a building block for that. However, the nefarious side of development finance and development support is that you go through a layer of institutional structures that in essence, in many cases, end up as the gatekeepers. And representation tend to be mediated through those gatekeepers. And therefore, opening doors, being present in critical tables, therefore is contingent on the ability to access these tables, being there, which is Garrett's point. And the boardrooms is where decisions are being made, where these kinds of innovative thinking, perhaps, might be encouraged, but are not necessarily always accessible to those who we need on the ground. So I think this is an interesting challenge. This is my way of encapsulating and perhaps putting a particular sort of frame to the kinds of issues and discussions that may not have surfaced explicitly, but I think would be of interest to other participants and perhaps panel members if they would like to address that. So with those, I would like to open the floor, and also towards the end, if you would allow us another few minutes to have our panels make their last comments. Questions from the floor? Yes, please, Eric.
Thank you very much for very interesting presentations. One of the presentations explicitly mentioned the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework with the assets, in mentioning the assets, which are often a target for adaptation. But it seems to me that all the presentations were talking about another aspect of the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework that isn't often emphasized, which is institutions, which reflect and enable power relationships that can be formal or informal. And it seemed to me that in the different approaches that were mentioned, there were broadly 4 things that could happen. You could challenge institutions in a strategic way or an inadvertent way, or you can work with them in a strategic way or an unreflective way. And the inadvertent and unreflective approaches are not good, but what seems to me a challenge, and I would welcome the thoughts of the panel on this, is that whether you challenge strategically or work with existing institutions strategically, there are problems with both approach. What should one think about when approaching this thicket of existing institutions in order to best work with neglected groups? Thank you.
Thank you. Hand from Salim, and there at the back, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Salim Ul-Haq, Director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development. I'd like to thank all the speakers for some very thought-provoking presentations. I'd like to make two comments. The first one, on behalf of one of the panelists who wasn't able to come here today, Dr. Atiq Rahman from the Bangladesh Center for Advanced Studies, is a point of information. Almost exactly a month from now, he and I will be hosting